Jonathan Revenge by Valinda, a comedy romance mystery for a mature audience.
As Jonathan sits outside the NFL doctor's office, he contemplates having his mother and her gang of friends murdered. Waiting for the appointed NFL team doctor was the most extended wait in his life. Of course, the doctor would give him bad news. He remembered all the earlier times his mother and her gang of friends stopped him from doing what he wanted. Now the seven prostitutes made their way into the life of the NFL's team physician. There was no doubt that the doctor would tell him he couldn't play professional football because of injuries to the head during college. Jonathan remembered a couple of blows to the head in college, but nothing serious. The head injuries details were fabricated, just like the doctor's report. His 7 mothers didn't want him to play professional football. Jonathan sat there with his head down, vowing to himself that he would get control over his life, even if he had to stash the bodies of the 7 women. It never occurred to him his injuries were real and may have been the reason for his horrible headaches. Jonathan understood he was born to a mother who raised him with 6 other women of the night. They were a family, a strange family, but still a family. The nurse finally called his name, Jonathan Bankston. Jonathan responded with a nervous smile. The nurse led him into the doctor's office. It was only a few steps, but felt like 1,000 yards. At 6 feet 2 inches and 220 pounds, Jonathan extended his hand to shake the hand of a much shorter male doctor. The doctor said, "Mr. Bankston, you can never play for an NFL football team. Your college injuries to the head and the possibility of repeated injuries are too great. I'm sorry. This decision is for your protection as a league." "To be polite," Jonathan said, "thank you," as he stood up to leave. Jonathan felt his own personality turn cold and aloof. His heart dropped as he turned to leave the doctor's office. His dreams of playing in the NFL were officially over, and he blamed his birth mother and all 6 of her friends. Jonathan didn't believe the doctor. He had seen how his mothers acted when he was drafted into the NFL. They didn't want him to play professional ball. In fact, they wanted him to continue traveling with one of them like he did when he was a child. Jonathan walked out into the hallway of the medical building and pushed the elevator button. He waited for the elevator to take him down, way down. There were no words for his disappointment, and no one was there to console him. He felt weak in his legs, almost like he couldn't hold up his weight, much less a football career. Jonathan managed to get home, but not before stopping at the liquor store on the other side of town. With the car parked in the parking lot, he waited for one of the guys to approach him. After sitting there for 20 minutes and neither of the 2 guys approached him, Jonathan hit the car's dashboard with his fist. Damn those guys. They instructed the guys never to sell to him. Why else would they ignore him? Jonathan had to admit he too was frightened of his 7 mothers. He knew they instructed the guys never to sell to him. Jonathan sat in his car thinking about how he would make each of his mothers pay for interfering in his life. He remembered back to the first time they interfered in his life. They forced him to stop hanging out with his buddy TJ, who lived in Hunters Point. His mother said it was because TJ had a brother who was a gang member. Then they made him break up with Angie, the only girl he ever liked. The reason given was that Angie was the daughter of one of their top clients. Jonathan was confused. He thought Angie's father, an African American, was a judge. 3 months into his bout with depression, Angie called. "I'm worried about you. You haven't called, and I miss you." Jonathan didn't know how to respond. He wasn't ready to see Angie yet. There was a pause. "Jonathan, I'm coming over." She hung up the phone before he could respond. The condo was a mess, plus it smelled. Jonathan opened the sliding glass doors. The Golden Gate Bridge and the city's Marina district were fully viewed. It was a beautiful day. The fog had lifted, leaving a warm glaze on the city and the bridge. Jonathan darted around the condo, picking up and cleaning everything he could get his hands on. After jumping in and out of the shower, he calmed down and waited for Angie to arrive. When his mothers made him stop seeing each other, he and Angie continued to meet up secretly. They continued to date other people. The time never seemed right for them to Jonathan was hoping this would change. When the buzzer went off, he jumped over the couch to buzz Angie in. He ran to the elevator to greet Angie. He wondered how long it would take for the elevator to reach the 20th floor. Angie was wearing a tight-fitting business suit with a split up the side of the skirt. Jonathan forgot about the NFL and his plot against his mothers when he saw her. He just wanted to undress her. Jonathan realized from his reaction to seeing Angie that he was in love with her. She was like pure oxygen to him. He still didn't trust women, but made an exception for Angie. Jonathan believed most women were like his mothers, without the label of being. He understood that Angie was no different, but for some reason it was okay. Little did Jonathan realize that the judge, Angie's father, understood that one day Jonathan would be legally accepted into one of the wealthiest families in America. He secretly encouraged his daughter to marry Jonathan. The judge knew that once Jonathan's case came up in court, any judge who heard the case would be inclined to listen to the case more carefully if a judge's daughter was involved. Jonathan welcomed Angie into his arms as they embraced and kissed for a long moment. Once inside the condo, Angie placed her finger over Jonathan's mouth when he started to speak. With the other hand, she began unbuttoning her blouse.
To experience the full romantic scene, you can purchase the complete ebook on the Kindle store. Please note that YouTube and the BuzzBooks and Beyond channel are committed to maintaining a respectful environment for all advertisers.
Angie hurried and took a shower. It was her lunch hour and she needed to return to work. She wasn't sure if her marriage worked. Once she was gone, Jonathan fell asleep on the couch. When he woke up several hours later, he was still in heaven from his encounter with Angie. But Jonathan realized he had to continue his plan of getting his life back. Jonathan kept thinking he had to get a plan to serve revenge on his mothers. He had to find his birth father. All he knew was that his father was from a wealthy family who would never admit to fathering a son with a black. Somehow revenge didn't seem so important after his afternoon with Angie. Yet Jonathan knew he had to gain control over his life, or his relationship with Angie would be over before it started. Jonathan wasn't interested in his father's wealth. He needed his father's power. Jonathan needed help with the evil women of 7. This need for control over his life gave him the energy to start a small business once football season ended. He needed to be able to support Angie. The relationship gave him the strength to move forward after months of depression. Jonathan called his birth mother and asked that the private jet be sent to him within the next week. Bernice, his birth mother, knew better than to ask him why. His attitude had not been good after being cut from the team. For months, when she called, he would either pick up the phone and hang it up or let it ring until it went to voicemail, which was full. Jonathan made up his mind. He was going to open a professional mobile tax service. Passing the exam to become an enrolled agent with the Internal Revenue Service had been one of his better decisions in college. His motivation was that Angie studied for and passed the same exam. He would now be the taxman for his mothers and dozens of other Americans worldwide. Most of these women earned 6 figures a year and never filed taxes. They needed his help.
Jonathan continued to think about how to find his biological father. Once again, he had a small glimmer of hope of regaining control over his life. For a week, Jonathan made appointments with American called women worldwide. The response was overwhelmingly good. Jonathan was giving most of his personal power to his new clients in hopes that they would shield him from the deadly 7. It wasn't that he trusted his new clients any more than he trusted his mother's. Jonathan was determined to break the psychological hold his mothers had over him. He had no way of knowing he was a piece of a puzzle the women of 7 would kill to protect. After a week of making calls, Jonathan boarded the private jet his mother's leased. The plane landed at the Hayward Airport in a smaller town across the Bay Bridge. Jonathan took Bart to the Hayward BART station and a cab to the small airport. On his way to Hayward, he called Angie, now working part-time and attending law school in San Francisco. After talking to her, Jonathan felt better about his life and his future. He told Angie that he would be back in a couple of weeks. "Maybe I should have enrolled in law school with you," Angie replied. "If it weren't for my father pushing me, I wouldn't be in law school." Airport security for private jet travelers was a breeze. Jonathan understood why his mothers leased a private plane. He boarded the plane feeling a little like his old self, handsome, in control on the outside and out of control on the inside, except when he was on the football field. Now he had Angie in his heart. He felt the need to be more responsible. Even though he was half white, he was raised as a black man, and that's the only way he knew to interact with the world. He hoped he could be a good husband. Jonathan tightened his seatbelt and closed his eyes as the jet prepared to take off. He always felt chills when the plane lifted off. As the plane gained altitude, an old leather book fell to the floor from a compartment in one of the seats across from where he was sitting. Jonathan picked up the leather book, which he realized was a personal journal. As he began to turn the pages, he saw his name several times in the names of his 7 mothers. He realized the journal belonged to his birth mother, Bernice. Jonathan began to read. My family, Melissa, was an award of the court. She never got adopted and could not earn a living after she turned 18. Working the streets was the only money she had. She's good at her job and doesn't care who knows it. Marilyn and Melissa grew up in the same foster home. Neither of them had a dime when they turned 18. The streets were the only place to go. They are John's, but he never loved them the way he loved me. Marilyn was abused when she was 13. That's the reason they took her from her mother's house. When Marilyn gets angry, she starts cursing us in Spanish. Melissa curses her back, and they have an entire argument without anyone knowing what they said. My name is Bernice. My greatest fear is that I'm not pretty enough for the client. After my son was born, it didn't matter anymore. I loved his father and knew I wasn't supposed to have feelings for a trick, but William was different. We were in love, so I thought. He treated me like his lady until that afternoon. My parents in Alabama would have a fit if they knew what I was doing for a living. Being bipolar has not been easy. The medicine and the 8-to-5 job didn't mix. After I got caught shoplifting for the second time, the judge told me I had to take my medication or go to jail. I started taking the medication but couldn't keep a job, so I started working the streets. I missed John, my true pimp. Never understood why he had to go and become a preacher. Now he has more than he can handle. Janelle is now our group leader. She ran John off because she caught him in the wrong lane. I don't want Jonathan to ever know the truth about Janelle. There are some things better left unsaid. Janelle was given up for adoption at birth. Her adoptive parents changed their minds and took her back to the orphanage. We are the only real family she has. I wish she would have the operation and stop using drugs and making everybody unhappy just cause of nature's mistake. Everybody knows not to argue with her. Janelle will hit you before she will argue with you. The twins always mess with her mind. The twins are cruel. Jenny and Jennifer, the twins, are evil. If they are not tricking people over their identity, they are setting people up for emotional disasters. But we love them, no matter what. That is their nature. They have more clients than any of us, except for Janelle. Men like that double action stuff. Kelly was enrolled in law school. She started doing tricks to help pay for law school. The money was so good that she dropped out of school and incorporated our business. We got papers and everything. Kelly taught us how to figure out a trick's real net worth. For her important dates, she rents $10,000 gowns and expensive jewelry. Kelly is the only bitch I know who demands $2,500 a night and never lets a trick touch her. Her territory is London, but she does gigs all over the world. Men love her because they can't touch her. Imagine that. The girl got game. This is my son Jonathan, whom I love more than anything. God, I hope he forgives me for thing I do is for him. Please, God, make him understand. Jonathan kept turning the pages until he got to the part about his mother being pregnant with him. I didn't want this child, but it is a part of the plan. So I have to go through with it. I love William, but I can't tell the others because they will laugh at me for loving a trick. Jonathan thought, OMG, my mother loved my father, but that thought was overshadowed when he wondered what plan his mother was talking about. Jonathan read and reread certain parts of his mother's journal for 3 hours, but he still didn't understand everything. He felt sick, relieved, and a little frightened all at the same time. No wonder he was never able to take control of his life. The 7 women had his life planned from the day he was born. The plane began its descent. Jonathan woke up from a light sleep. He looked at his watch and realized he'd slept for 2 hours. He quickly closed the journal and placed it back into the compartment. Jonathan was curious if his mother had left the journal there on purpose or forgot to take it off the plane. Jonathan's mothers were wealthy, top-of-the-line international escorts who had gone from walking the streets on West MacArthur Boulevard in Oakland, California, to international private escort service. The women had clients in every major city in the world. Jonathan chuckled just when he remembered when his mothers purchased whatever they were missing in the looks department. Breast, hip, facelift, and hair sewn to their scalp, all from the same doctors the Hollywood stars used. He didn't recognize them when they returned from Los Angeles. Money was never a concern for his mothers. Jonathan stayed in contact with Angie via text and cell phone. He could tell she was ready to get married. He figured out that the after and he was happy with the thought of marrying her. It was his dinner date with Angie that proved to be extremely helpful. Angie revealed that she investigated her father's secret files and found more information on his mother and her friends. As it turned out, the plan was to blackmail the Randolph family for millions. The women would remain silent about the scam the Randolph family pulled 23 years ago and about Jonathan's birth in exchange for a big payday down the road. Jonathan's mothers were upset that Bernice was used to pull off a business scam on another family, especially a family who wasn't as wealthy. Angie didn't know all the details. Your father took your mother to an afternoon cocktail party. She thought she was on a date, and your father made her half-dozen men to consummate a deal they were trying to pull off. Your mother was distraught and came home crying to Jane L. Kelly called my father and told him what was going on. My father did some investigating and found out what the deal was. Jonathan interrupted Angie. How do you know my mother's names? Angie. Don't be silly, Jonathan. Everybody knows your mothers. Your mother and her friends are some of the richest women in the country. Jonathan's mouth opened wide. He thought what his mothers did was a secret. Jonathan, go on, he said after Angie cocked her head to the side as if to say, get real, Angie. Well, Melissa became friends with your father's real girlfriend. She told her that if she really wanted William, she needed to get pregnant by another man and blame it on William so that he would be obligated to marry her. Angie exhaled. Jonathan, Angie. Yes, he writes everything down because he forgets. Jonathan thought. So his father's oldest child wasn't his child. Jonathan understood two things. One, he was the heir to one of the wealthiest families in America, and two, his pretty little girlfriend understood he was heir to possibly billions. The plan was he'd show up with the correct DNA, and the gang would be paid to remain silent. They would force his wife to help them get paid, or they would tell the entire world her first child wasn't her husband's. It was all about a payday for the Deadly Seven. And his pretty little girlfriend, Angie, knew all the details. This was blackmail, and Jonathan wasn't sure how he wanted to handle it. Surely this would be the opportunity to screw up his mother's plans, like they had screwed up his plans. Jonathan started getting a headache and wondered if his previous concussions were a problem. He was a little nervous after discovering he was one of the heirs to a significant fortune. Jonathan decided he would contact his father to eliminate any suggestions of blackmail. With this thought, he called to his father's office. He asked to speak with his father's assistant and informed the receptionist that it was an urgent personal family matter. Jonathan could tell the receptionist didn't believe him, but she connected him to his father's assistant. Jonathan explained that he believed he was Mr. Randolph's son. He quickly gave the secretary his mother's name and contact information. Jonathan hung up the phone, and relief came over him. He wanted control over his life. He wanted his mother and her gang of friends to stop trying to control him. Yes, he understood he was a trust fund baby, but not allowing him to play professional football was cruel. Jonathan felt liberated by his actions, which he dared not share with his mothers. He continued to work his tax business while sharing the private jet with his mothers. Returning to California to see Angie was all a part of his plan. A couple of days later, when Jonathan was leaving Rio de Janeiro, his mother surprised him. Bernice was aboard the plane when it arrived. Jonathan, how are you?" she asked as she hugged him. "Jonathan, I'm okay, Mama. What brings you to Rio? Jonathan asked, with a hint of bare tone in his voice. Jonathan sat down, buckled himself in, and waited for what could only be a lashing for contacting his father. As he suspected, his father contacted his mother and asked whether they had a son. When she broke down and confirmed that they did, he wanted to know how that was possible, since he always wore protection. Jonathan's mother told him that the rubber had leaked. The truth was far from that. Several months after the afternoon cocktail party, Bernice waited until she was ovulating to have sex with William. She used the sperm from the condom to insert the warm sperm into her, using a turkey baster. After Bernice revealed this information, Jonathan felt dead inside, as if he were the result of a robbery. It didn't take long before he understood why his mother was so honest. She didn't want him to have any doubts about who his father was. She told her son the truth to make him strong. After explaining that the other 6 women had lived for the time when the wealthy family would have to pay for their silence about his birth, she explained that a lot was riding on who he was, and that it was best to go along with the program. Jonathan's mother looked at him for a long moment and replied, "Bernice, yes, it's blackmail because your father and his family used me to scam another family, a family that is now one of the largest distributors in North America. Your father's family would be more than happy to pay." Tears started to roll down her cheek, something Jonathan wasn't used to. His mother was strong even though she was bipolar. To see her crying was upsetting to him. With tears rolling down her face, Bernice continued, "Bernice, I know you're upset because you couldn't do what you wanted. I made a pact with the devil, and these people could hurt you if I don't follow through." Jonathan went to hug his mother when she pulled away and said, "Bernice, there's more. Janelle was born with both sexes and she controls everything. If we cross her, there could be trouble." Jonathan turned his eyes away from his mother. He needed to think. His mother's pimp was a woman with both male and female organs. That was the joke he kept hearing while growing up, but never understood. Janelle had all the bases covered. Janelle chased his mother's first pimp away. After they had, he became a preacher and wanted Jonathan's mother to follow him, but Janelle and the others stopped her. Now, everything was making sense to Jonathan. He looked back into his mother's eyes and replied, "Jonathan, but Janelle has more clients than all of you put together." She laughed. "Bernice, of course she does. The front and the back." Jonathan smiled at his mother's response. After he heard enough, Jonathan pushed back into his seat and told his mother not to worry. He explained that if his father went to the police, they all could be looking at prison time. He also helped his mother to remember men as wealthy as his father sometimes eliminated problems by causing the people involved to disappear. No sooner after the words were out of his mouth, Jonathan and his mother looked at the cockpit door. Would they arrive safely in San Francisco? The flight back to the United States was, well, tense. Once the plane landed, Jonathan's mom told him that she needed to call a meeting with the group and find out what they were planning. She encouraged Jonathan to meet with his father as quickly as possible, and to never mention that she was on the flight. She gave Jonathan his father's office number and asked him to give his father a hug for her. With that, Jonathan got off the plane and headed to the customs area in the Hayward airport. As Jonathan expected, his father's attorney called to set up an appointment for a DNA test. When Jonathan heard the words DNA, he understood why his mother had come clean about how she got pregnant. Jonathan was confident and prepared for whatever his father's attorney asked. He agreed to the testing and wrote down the clinic information that would perform the test. 3 weeks passed before he received the telephone call he'd been waiting for. His father's secretary called to set a lunch date at the restaurant atop the Hilton Hotel in downtown San Francisco. Jonathan was sure his father had hired someone to investigate his background and get a full report on his mother and her gang of friends. During this time, Jonathan began to wonder if the success of his mother's business wasn't entirely their own doing. Jonathan couldn't put his finger on it, but he was sure his father had overseen, or at least laid the groundwork for his mother's international success. The lunch meeting with his father went well in the beginning. Jonathan looked like a younger and darker version of his father. Jonathan himself could see himself in his father with the same good looks, large hands, and the same mannerisms. Jonathan felt chills when he reached out to shake his father's hand. His father pulled him to him and hugged him instead. Jonathan smiled as he and his father stood there and looked at one another. The two men laughed and joked about the deadly seven. Jonathan, all the women raised me, and at least one, if not more, was at every major high school function and college game. Jonathan's father laughed and blurted, "Father, sure, they had to watch their money." Jonathan stopped laughing as he asked his father, "Did you know about their plan?" "Father, yes. You don't get where I am without knowing what others are planning. Of course, I didn't really believe that you were my son. The DNA results were a surprise to me." I guess the rubber really did leak. He sounded as if he was talking to himself. The man Jonathan would come to know as his father wiped his mouth with his napkin and leaned forward. "Are planning on asking me for a lot of money to keep their mouth shut about you. I never decided if I would pay, but when you called and wanted to meet, I realized you weren't a part of their scam." Jonathan could see that his father was proud of him. Jonathan learned he had a younger half-sister and an older brother who wasn't his half-brother. "Jonathan." "How did you know?" Jonathan asked in surprise. "Father, there was a boating accident and the child needed a blood transfusion. I wasn't a match. My wife and I swept it under the carpet so the press wouldn't get involved, but I'll be damned if I leave my family's fortune to another man's child." Jonathan felt this was the right time to tell his father he hadn't called because of money. "Jonathan, I need help getting control over my life from the gang." His father listened as Jonathan explained what the women did. Mr. Randolph admitted that he was happy that his firstborn wasn't bumping heads and exchanging energy on a football field with other men. He jokingly said, "Son, if you like football so much, we can buy an NFL team." With that, the men laughed and talked late into the afternoon. Finally, Jonathan's father said, "Father, I'll tell you what, I will set up a limited trust account for you and make a public statement that you are my son, conceived before my marriage. That way the women can't say or do anything. All they can do is keep on being what they've always been." Cut like a knife across Jonathan's heart. The he was referring to were his mother's. Jonathan saw right through his father at that moment. True, the women had mistreated him emotionally. It was also true he wanted to get back at them for what they'd done, but he didn't feel right about his father's statement. He looked at his father in the eye and asked, "John, would it be okay if I share the trust fund money with my mothers?" Jonathan's father looked at him for a long moment and said, "Father, sure, why not? But you have to let them know it's your idea because I'm not giving those a dime." Jonathan continued to be polite like his mother taught him when someone upset him. He decided right then and there. The courts would decide his share of the vast fortune. His father lost his right to determine how much he would receive as an heir, all because he referred to his mother as a female dog. Jonathan just wanted to get back to Angie and his clients. He realized the power to control his life was in knowing the truth. In his heart, he really didn't care what his mother's or father did. Jonathan's revenge surrounded the fact that he was a better person than his mother's and his father. His attorney, who would be selected by his future father-in-law. His father-in-law would quietly handle the legal battle for his share of the wealth. He now had control over his life. All it took was learning the truth.